everybody, welcome to our Neurodiversity online conference. My name's Niall. I'm here with our first pair of speakers today. Let's get started with our first talk. Ruth is an existential psychotherapist who has been working with neurodivergent individuals, families, and couples for over 18 years. She's worked in NHS mental health services, specialist autism centres, and charities. Currently, she's the course lead for the Autism and Neurodiversity postgraduate programs at the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling in London. Ruth specialises in working with LGBTQIA+ neurodivergent people in individual and group settings. Danny van Deurzen Smith is an existential coach and course leader for the MA in existential coaching at the New School of Psychotherapy and Counselling. Danny co-facilitates a monthly support group for LGBTQ+ autistic adults with Ruth and runs regular workshops on gender fluidity, working existentially with autism, and existential coaching. You can learn more about the accredited neurodiversity course that Danny and Ruth teach on at the New School by going to bit.ly/ND-course. I'll include that link in the chat as well. So without further ado, Danny and Ruth, it's really great to have you with us here today, and just get going. Best of luck.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thank
It's
you.
really lovely to be with you all and to be able to talk to you about this topic. It's something that Danny and I are super passionate about. So it's a real treat to be able to chat with you today. So we hope that we're going to be able to give you an intro into supporting neurodivergent clients, and be able to give you some ideas to go away with today as well, some kind of strategies and some things that hopefully will be helpful. But let's get started by thinking about language and about definitions. Many of you may have noticed that over the last couple of years, whether it's social media or whether it's in the news, terms like neurodiversity, neurodivergent have become more and more kind of well known and spoken about, which is fantastic. But the actual term neurodiversity was first created by autistic online community, actually, in the 90s. And then it was coined by an academic called Judy Singer. And neurodiversity is describing the natural variation that there is in terms of the human brain and cognition. And what it's getting at is the idea of what's sometimes called the neurodivergent paradigm, that instead of having normal and abnormal cognition and cognitive functioning, what there actually is a whole load of diversity in terms of how our brains work. And that's what's normal. And so instead of, it's kind of talking about this move away from considering things like autism, ADHD as a pathology. What it actually is a natural variation that we see, in the same way that we have differences in hair color and differences in height. There are differences in terms of learning, memory, attention, emotion, sociability. So all of these are kind of cognitive functions, and how we experience them varies. So neurotypical, you can see at the green side of this, is the majority of the human population. So that's the majority of the human population and the way that they cognitively process and function. If you're neurodivergent, then your brain functions in a slightly different way. And that could be one of the neurodevelopmental conditions, and that's what we most often think about when we talk about a neurodivergent person. So autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, but also it's been used to talk about things like schizophrenia, bipolar, intellectual disability, where there's also differences in terms of information processing. There are various different, each different neurodivergent condition has its own unique features, but there are also aspects that are similar, are shared across most neurodivergent people. So one of these things is what we call executive functioning. And executive functioning is basically the brain's PA, the way we organize and the way we plan, and all of those kind of key ways that we process our everyday lives. So for example, so Danny is autistic, And Danny has an excellent memory and working memory, but struggles with prioritizing. I'm dyslexic. I have a terrible working memory, but I'm better at prioritizing. And so each of us come under the neurodivergent banner. We all have differences in our executive functioning, but how they manifest is different depending on the specific diagnosis that we have. And so it's useful to kind of think about this when you're working with people and what it might be that they may be experiencing in those aspects. Another area that is common for many people who identify as neurodivergent are sensory differences. So this is something that we see very often with autistic individuals, but other individuals, ADHD, dyspraxic, may also have differences in their sensory experience. So you've got the usual ones that most of us know about, so taste and touch, sight, sound, smell, and they might be hyper or hyposensitive to those things. There are also vestibular, which is our awareness of balance and movement, proprioception, which is knowing where we are in space, knowing where our body is in space, and interoception, which is knowing what's going on inside our body, our awareness of pain, our awareness of emotions even. And individuals who are neurodivergent can experience differences on all of these things. So for example, people who are dyspraxic may have differences in terms of proprioception. And you may have seen on YouTube, there's a couple of really cool videos that neurodivergent people have done around kind of their sensory experience of going to the supermarket and what that can be like. And it gives you a flavor of how these things can impact kind of everyday life in a kind of profound way. The other one that's really useful to think about that goes kind of across the neurodivergent umbrella are social and communication differences. So again, it will vary depending on the profile, but for somebody who's autistic, they may really like direct, specific communication and struggle with more non-verbal communication. Somebody who's dyspraxic or ADHD might find group situations and group conversations really difficult to keep up with and to know when to jump in. So there are these areas that, although there are distinct features, there are also similar areas of difference. And the other thing to flag up when we think of neurodivergent clients is that there's a really high level of comorbidity. So it's really common that someone might have a diagnosis of autism and dyspraxia, or dyslexia and dyspraxia. So we see that a lot. So again, having an understanding of what's going on overall is useful. And the key thing really is exploring the individual's specific profile, what their challenges are, what their strengths are, and finding out what that means for that person. Sometimes there are kind of simplifying concepts and language that are used, like mild autism, or we've got a little bit of ADHD. And unfortunately, those types of language really aren't helpful in terms of understanding what's going on for a person. It's much more about appreciating that there are unique neurodivergent profiles that may have similar areas of overlap, but a unique presentation. Now, we haven't got time to go through all of them with you today, but I'm going to highlight a few of the diagnoses, neurodivergent diagnoses, and I would encourage you to kind of read up and dig into all of the different diagnoses that are around. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is where there is a difference in the way that the brain is planning, task initiating, attending. And that can mean that individuals are highly creative, very innovative, can be impulsive, both in terms of their behavior, but also in terms of their thinking. And again, that's the same with hyperactivity. You know, they can be impulsive hyperactively, but also in terms of their thinking. And one of the things that's often not known is that ADHD people can be super focused when it comes to particular interests, although really struggle in other ways. And it's worth flagging up that There's more and more over the last few years, the research is starting to get a greater awareness of ADHD within girls and women, something that really wasn't understood before. And there's often issues around misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis still. Autism. Okay, so I've spoken a little bit about that. Some of the main things. One is difference in communication. So a real love of specific, direct, often written language as opposed to verbal. Many individuals' experience is a difficulty in tuning into the kind of neurotypical Wi-Fi, is the term I like to use. So all of that non-verbal communication that gets used in generally in most situations, particularly neurotypical situations, tuning into that's harder. And that means that socializing in certain settings can be really difficult. There's also something called monotropism, which is a preference for attending to one thing rather than multiple things. And this is linked to the hyperfocus that a lot of autistic people have. The deep, profound interest in certain things, attention to detail, love of routines and rituals. And then we also see sensory differences and executive functioning differences, as I mentioned earlier. So everyone will be slightly different, autistic person, in terms of how they manifest in these aspects, but we will see them in varying ways. Finally, I just wanted to talk about dyspraxia. Now, dyspraxia is one that doesn't get talked about a lot. There is a massive need for more research, but actually the prevalence is quite high. So about 6% of the population. Some studies would suggest that possibly nearer 10. And it's to do with difficulties in coordination, sequencing, both movement, so in terms of gross movement and fine motor movement, but also in terms of organizing one's speech or one's thinking. And so it can have an impact on all the kind of experiences of being in the world. But we also know that there's a massive kind of wealth of creativity, problem-solving ability, good strategic thinking within lots and lots of dyspraxic individuals. Now, I wanted to have a brief pause to think specifically about emotions and empathy. Now, there is a big myth, or certainly has been for a long, long time, that autistic individuals and neurodivergent individuals broadly are not able to be empathetic or are non-emotional. And in fact, that absolutely isn't the case. Lots of autistic neurodivergent people are incredibly emotionally sensitive and actually may be extremely attuned and overwhelmed by the emotions of others. And I love this little graphic here, which is written by a autistic cartoonist, where it's actually kind of highlighting the intensity of the feelings that she experiences. What there is a difference in terms of how emotion is experienced. So for some, it may be that it's difficult to tune into the non-verbal communication of others, particularly if that's done in a neurotypical way. So all of the non-verbal facial expressions, body language, hard to tune in, and therefore it's hard to understand what's going on. When that's communicated, when that's expressed directly, empathy, understanding can then come forth. For other people, it's about a difficulty in understanding and communicating their own emotions, being able to feel into and then articulate what's going on inside. And this is also called alexithymia. It's something that's present across the population, but we see a higher prevalence within the neurodivergent population. And what that means is that it can be really difficult to know what's going on with you emotionally. It also means that emotions can kind of feel like they come out of nowhere, or it can be tricky to distinguish between yourself and other people.
So it can be hard to kind of figure out, which emotion is my bit and which emotion is their bit. And there may be idiosyncratic expressions of emotion. So when someone's feeling really anxious, it may come across in a more angry way, purely because they're not displaying emotion in the kind of standard neurotypical way. So these are the things that are kind of useful to kind of have in mind whenever we're working with neurodivergent clients. And a final point on this. So there's a autistic academic called Damian Milton, who, as a critique to the idea that autistic people don't have empathy, created the double empathy problem. And what he's highlighting here, I think, is really important for kind of therapists and any practitioners to be aware of, is that rather than it being that the autistic person is not able to empathize, what's actually going on is a difficulty both ways. The autistic person may struggle to read between the lines, struggle to tune into the kind of the non-verbal Wi-Fi, but the non-autistic person is also struggling to understand what the autistic person is experiencing. And we get a disconnect. And I think this actually can be a useful template when we think of any neurodivergent individual and what can happen relationally that leads to often a lot of issues that they experience.
So I'm going to talk a little bit now about neurodivergent identities, and particularly around kind of, I guess, the language and culture of how we identify ourselves within the neurodivergent community. So there are lots of differences in the use of terminology that people will choose to identify themselves. So you might hear people talking about ND for neurodivergent as a kind of umbrella term. You might hear people referring to themselves as AUTI, as in short for autistic. You might hear ADHD for people who have a diagnosis of both autism and ADHD, whether that's a formal diagnosis or a self-diagnosis. And you might hear the term ASPI, short for the term Asperger syndrome. There's actually a lot of debate within the autistic community around the use of the term Asperger syndrome, which for many people has been an extremely useful term, a term which they may have been formally diagnosed with. It's not a term that people are diagnosed with now. That meant a particular sort of presentation of autism. It would now be more similar to what they call level 1 autism when you get a diagnosis in this country. But it's obviously named after Hans Asperger, who was a very, very problematic individual. And so a lot of people, even if that is their formal diagnosis, will not use that term because they do not want to have that association at all. So there's some important things to be aware of there. Identity first language is also a really important part of this conversation. So a lot of the time what you'll hear generally neurotypical people saying is they will talk about a person with autism or a person who has autism, whereas autistic people almost always, and the research backs this up, tend to prefer identity first language. So instead of describing themselves as a person with autism, they would prefer to describe themselves as an autistic person. So recognizing that that experience of autism is core to our identity rather than treating it kind of linguistically as if it were a disease that we don't consider to be a part of ourselves. So that's a really important part of that kind of piece around identity and how people use this kind of these kind of descriptors. The important thing, of course, working therapeutically is about listening to how people identify themselves and taking their lead, because it's so diverse how people do choose to identify themselves, and most of us will have thought about it pretty long and hard. So that's the really key part. There's also a bit around disability as opposed to difference. So there's quite a lot, again, of range in terms of how people will identify as a neurodivergent individual, whether they identify as having a disability or whether they identify purely as having a difference that they don't necessarily consider to be a disability. In terms of the law, it comes under that umbrella of disability. So legally, in terms of rights, in all sorts of ways, it would fall under that disability umbrella. But many people who are neurodivergent wouldn't necessarily consider it a disability. So that's an important part as well. Ruth's kind of touched on this unhelpful language piece around you know, saying mild autism, or just having a bit of ADHD, or just being slightly dyslexic. They're all kind of judgments about the amount of struggle that someone is perceived to have. And actually, our perception of that struggle doesn't necessarily match the struggle that they experience internally. So normally what people mean when they say mild or just a bit is, oh, they don't really need my help. They seem to get along just fine. And of course, that often denies the lived experience of that person. So functioning labels can be really problematic. And a bit about self-diagnosis as well. I mentioned that just a second ago. Really important that there has been a lot of kind of stigma around self-diagnosis, really. And actually, most of the neurodivergent community that I've come across are pretty affirming of self-diagnosis. You know, diagnosis isn't always preferable for some people. It's something that kind of stays on your record, can influence things about the way that you're treated. For example, when you seek medical help about something, whether they have access to that medical record. It may not be something that somebody feels that they need to do. It's costly. So, you know, most people will have to pay to get a private diagnosis. That isn't necessarily accessible to everybody. The waiting times are extremely long for a diagnosis. So it's important to think about that claiming of one's identity for yourself, not necessarily needing that formal psychiatric diagnosis, unless that is right for that specific person, and unless they happen to have the resources to be able to access it. A really good hashtag to follow on Twitter, by the way, is actually autistic, because that sort of signposts when people are talking about autistic experiences from an actual autistic lived experience, which we need more of, frankly. So a bit about masking or camouflaging. This is Ruth's speciality. In fact, she just completed her doctoral project on this. So masking or camouflaging is a process of hiding your neurodivergent behaviours and adopting strategies to try to fit into the neurotypical majority. So playing the role of a neurotypical person, kind of learning the social cues, learning the things that you're expected to do, those social scripts that we're expected to follow, and often getting very good at mimicking those. Niall and us were having a conversation about this before we went into the webinar around the kind of prevalence of diagnosis for male people as opposed to people who are assigned female at birth, and a lot of that being about the kind of socialization of women and girls to basically be expected to be able to hold those sort of social graces, to be able to fit in more, to be, you know, to be polite, those sorts of things. So often people who are assigned female at birth can be quite good at masking and camouflaging because we've been taught to do it from a very, very early age. So that could mean getting good at mimicking other people. It could mean hiding stims. So stims being kind of movements or sensory things that we do to sort of self-regulate. So it could be things like hand flapping as a standard one, rocking, it's my absolute favorite one, playing with fiddle toys, fiddling with your hair, that kind of thing, that often neurodivergent people are taught from a very early age is not okay and must be hidden. It's a really exhausting thing to do. So even if somebody is really good at it, really well versed at that kind of mimicking, masking, camouflaging, it really takes a toll, and it's very confusing in terms of one's own identity. So of course, the more that we get into this process of mimicking and having to conform, often the more detached we feel from our own sense of self. And that can be really isolating, because then we're never really showing up in a group as us, we're showing up as what we believe we're supposed to be. Now, everybody does that to an extent, of course. Ruth and I are both existential practitioners, so a lot of the work that we do is all around sort of accepting those aspects of our being in the world with other people. But for ND people, it's much more intense. There's much more in terms of kind of hiding our natural tendencies, hiding our sort of natural way of being. And this goes across different diagnoses, and it's a huge intersectional issue, which I'll talk about in just a second as well, because there's so much important there. A little bit about neurodiversity and mental health. So there is a very, very high prevalence of lots of different mental health diagnoses for neurodivergent people, and particularly suicidality. So 94% of autistic people experience anxiety, and 83% experience depression. That's from a National Autistic Society study in 2020. So obviously that is a huge, huge chunk of neurodivergent, of autistic people. 80% of adults with ADHD have at least one coexisting psychiatric disorder. Mood and anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, and personality disorders are included within that. And there are a lot of issues around misdiagnosis as well. So what quite often happens is somebody who is neurodivergent as a young person particularly might be misdiagnosed with something else. They might be misdiagnosed as psychotic, schizophrenic, all sorts of things, because essentially they're being misread by the person in charge of that diagnosis. So there you've got some of that, going back to that double empathy problem, basically. A little bit about this minority stress model, because I think this is really important. And again, it goes back to some of those intersectional issues. So this is Monique Botha's minority stress model, and there's lots of great videos of talking about this online if you're interested in much more detail, and obviously with much more knowledge than me, since it is a model. And it's basically around the idea that having this social status as being a neurodivergent identity within a neuronormative culture produces certain minority stresses. So prejudice events, which would be like very obviously prejudiced things happening. So it might be things like getting stopped by police, for example, because you're not behaving in a way that is seen to be normal, and that's read by neurotypical people as being suspicious. There's kind of everyday discrimination, so more like microaggressions that you might come across. Expectations of rejection, so that kind of holding and knowing that you're more prone to getting rejected, and perhaps a particular sensitivity around rejection as well. Stigma concealment, so again, this process of having to hide yourself, hide the way that you show up, and then the internalized stigma that produces. So in the same way that a queer person might have internalized homophobia or transphobia, a neurodivergent person might have internalized, I don't know, neurophobia. What do you call it? Not sure. I'm not sure that we have the correct coined term yet. We probably do, and I'm just missing it. And then on top of that, you've got this idea that there are certain resources that you need in order to build resilience to kind of mitigate for these things that are a part of having that neurodivergent status. So things like social support, connectedness within the community, which incidentally can both be really difficult things for neurodivergent people to actually access because of that propensity for isolation, that difficulty in communication and understanding each other. And then the kind of proven outcomes of these minority stresses, and this goes across different minority statuses, this is not unique to neurodivergent individuals. It's proven that experiences of those minority stresses are more likely to produce negative mental health experiences, negative physical health experiences, issues around psychological and social well-being, and health risk behaviours. So it's really important in terms of understanding the big picture of living as a neurodivergent person, and how all of these things might create a certain experience of being in the world, might create more risk of certain experiences. And as I was saying, this is not a unique thing to neurodivergent individuals. This is something that happens when we're a part of any minority group, any oppressed group. So people who hold both a neurodivergent identity and another minority identity are more likely to experience those minority stresses, the kind of the chance of that effectively goes up. So for example, if you're also a person of colour whilst being neurodivergent, you're even more likely to get stopped by the police in a prejudice event, because you've got the double whammy of being a person of colour and therefore being more likely to be targeted, plus not behaving in a way that is deemed to be normal or sort of trustworthy. So all of this stuff factors into kind of other minority identities as well, and the interplay between those things. We've also got this sensory and processing overload piece, which is linked to this idea of the intense world theory. So the idea that a neurodivergent experience of the world is basically just a more intense experience of the world than a neurotypical one. So you can see those dials all running at 100 there, touch, taste, hearing, smell, sight, all coming in a very intense way. And when you experience the world in that intense way, you're more likely to get overloaded from a sensory perspective or from a processing data perspective. And that can lead to meltdowns, shutdowns, burnout. So these are very common experiences for neurodivergent people, and often are not necessarily understood by neurotypical people. So a meltdown can be experienced, particularly in children, as being sort of, you know, just having a mood, just having a bit of a Barney, you know, causing a bit of a ruckus, when actually it's an intelligible response to that sensory overload, to all of those things coming in at 100% and literally not being able to function, and just boom. So it's important to be aware of that with clients as well, and how that might show up in a session. You might have a neurodivergent client come in that shutdown mood and literally not be able to answer a question about how they feel in that moment because they have shut down due to overload. This is a little bit more around these intersectional issues. So this is a sort of one of the standard diagrams that people will go back to demonstrate intersectionality. So you've got this axis of domination and oppression. So the things over the axis are, in this culture, certainly considered to be privileged positions. They're the kind of normative positions, and then the kind of equivalent on the bottom end of the axis being the oppressed position. I always used to use this in my teaching, and I always used to point out that they did not have an axis for neuromaturity and neurominorities. That's why you can see that there in purple. You will notice that they do put in stuff around ableism, but it's all done in terms of physical and mental health rather than neurodivergence or neuronormativity. So again, an important distinction there.
When we're thinking about therapy and psychotherapy, neurodivergence informed therapy is a term that's very recently been created by Monique Bothar, who we referenced earlier, and Robert Chapman, two neurodivergent academics. And for me, this really encapsulates what Danny and I kind of is the foundation of our work. One is that it's coming from a neurodiversity perspective. So we are coming from that perspective, not pathologizing people, affirming the difficulties that they experience, but also coming from an awareness that is outside of that kind of pathologizing frame of reference. Also, we're coming from a neurodivergent positive approach. And so there is an emphasis on providing a supportive environment of acceptance and also affirmation of the awesomeness that may be there for that individual who's neurodivergent, in the same way that we might do that with our LGBTQIA+ clients, because there is their lived experience outside is very often not that, as Danny was mentioning. Having that as the foundation of the work we do therapeutically, I think, is really important in terms of allowing them the safety to then come into relation with you. Just a quick thing here about noting your assumptions around why a neurodivergent person may come into therapy. It may be to do with their diagnosis, it often is, but it also may have nothing to do with that, and it's to do with their everyday living, and we want to be understanding them from their holistic perspective, including their neurodivergence. Also, just putting a flag in the fact that the stats show us there is massively high prevalence of bullying, discrimination and harassment for neurodivergent individuals. So it's really common to be working with trauma, at least in part within the work you're doing with neurodivergent individuals. This is a work done by an autistic artist called Ryan, and it's a video installation, and it flashes, standby, it flashes like a pane of glass crashing, and he created it to try and give people a sense of what it's like to be a neurodivergent person. And for me, it just highlights the fact that it's about really letting go of our assumptions and examining the lived experience of the individual. As Danny mentioned, we're existentially trained and practitioners to a large extent. And so really kind of delving into that in a humble way is foundational when you're working with neurodivergent people. So a couple of things just to think about now. So one is environment, which makes sense, doesn't it? We've talked about, issues around sensory. We've talked about, issues around processing. So really thinking through what's the environment that you've got, how is it in terms of light, sound, waiting room? If you're working online, how is that for them? Is there an issue around, how easy it is for them to hear if they're using headphones? Also, have you made it really explicit what your expectations are around any online therapy that you do? All of that's often unspoken. But if you're expecting your client to, to not email you between sessions, or if you're expecting your client to be in a specific place when they have their therapy with you, that's really important to make clear, because that's the kind of cultural stuff that within the neurotypical culture, it's kind of understood without saying. But if you're outside of that, it's not so clear and it doesn't get articulated well. Final point I'll put up here is just to think about the fact that very often, Danny and I both work in multimodal ways. So I'll sometimes see somebody face to face. It may be that then they have a day where they're super hypersensitive, and so we'll do some work on the phone. I may have someone who actually only wants to see me on Zoom because trying to get into any place is actually too overwhelming. So having a real sense of flexibility around that and really questioning what your kind of assumptions are and what's possible for you to do. Things also like, how you structure and organize yourself, reminders for appointments can make a massive difference between someone being able to attend your sessions or not because of an executive functioning difference. Quick word here on language. So the pace of your language and the language that you use is really important. So kind of having a sense of clarity, checking stuff out, checking into some of the really kind of idiosyncratic language that people use. Everyone will have a kind of individual way of doing this, and it gives you a real possibility to kind of get into their world by linking into the language that makes sense for them, whether it's written or not written. This is an example of one of my clients who created a visual schedule for organizing themselves. They live independently, super capable, but being able to visually and also using their special interest, which is wolves, literally makes the difference between them being able to kind of cope with something or being in total meltdown. So most of our therapy, we were doing stuff that was based on wolves or based on, visual stuff. And we'd be talking around whole loads of things, but we'd have these as kind of anchors that we could link into. In terms of the research, very often CBT is the thing that's talked about. Mindfulness now is coming up as there being some evidence base for that. There is still a huge need for research also into the other neurodivergent identities. So, ADHD, dyspraxia, there's less on the kind of usefulness of therapy around that. So we know that CBT can be useful. However, it needs to be adapted and it won't work for everyone. So you want to be thinking around making it visual, taking longer. That's really important, having more sessions. It may be, about linking in a partner or a friend to help with putting in place some of the CBT techniques that you use outside of the therapy space, thinking about the impact of things like executive functioning differences or sensory differences. a point here that I think is a word of caution for all of us, including neurodivergent practitioners, is about not making neurotypical assumptions. So, if someone's abrupt or very direct, we may assume that they're being aggressive, but actually that could well be just their way of communicating, is just more abrupt and direct. Lateness, missing appointments, coming in a really chaotic way, sometimes is seen as being defensive or not wanting to engage in therapy, when actually very often it's an executive functioning difference. So it's really important for all of us, and as I said, I have to do this for myself to kind of check, what am I assuming here, and is it really what's going on? A final note on this is about relationships. Now, it's really easy, it's kind of within the society, in many societies anyway, there's an idea that kind of partner relationships, family relationships are most key, and we need them to be healthy. But a lot of neurodivergent people actually will connect with animals or with their interests or with nature, rather than connecting in kind of these traditional relational senses.
Exploring emotions, as we've said, the kind of emotional experience is a big part of that difference. So it's important to think about how we might explore emotions differently with neurodivergent clients. Emmy van Deurzen's emotional compass is a useful way of linking people's experience of their emotions to their values, which makes it a bit more practical, a bit more logical, which can help ND people with that kind of sort of irrational, illogical nature that emotion can seem to take, and can be very frustrating to the ND brain. So different ways to explore emotions. You might link it to physical expression. So if they have a bit of a problem with that interoceptive, alexithymic kind of experience, you could track their physical responses with things like Fitbits, or talk about their experience of their heart rate, for example, as a marker of what they might be feeling emotionally that doesn't require them to actually identify the emotion as the kind of starting point. And as Ruth was saying, linking emotional language to interests or more specific language. If they're into superheroes, they might be thinking about making a comic strip that explains their kind of emotional experience and compares it to that sort of more familiar place. So I've got one of these, a little box of fidgety toys and calming scents and things like that. So having some sort of toolkit, basically, of stims that somebody might use, or safe snacks or favorite books, things that are going to give that kind of comfort, can be a really useful thing. And actually providing fiddle toys or something in your therapy space is a good way of kind of crossing that bridge from neurotypical to neurodivergent, kind of just making it a normal thing that you might have something that they can fidget with during a session.
Fantastic. This is where I wanted to get to, Danny, because I think this is a great place for us to kind of wrap up. So you go for it.
So as existentialists, we work phenomenologically, and I think this is really, really key, because it goes back to this idea of focusing on eliciting rich description, bracketing our assumptions about what somebody might be feeling or thinking, and horizontalizing, so not jumping to conclusions about what in what somebody has said is more or less important than another thing in what they have said. So it's all about elucidating the person's worldview, and constantly verifying your understanding of that worldview. And I think this is so key. I mean, I think this is key with any client, but I think particularly with neurodivergent clients who might be very, very used to conveying a particular narrative that they think that a neurotypical person wants to hear, actually giving them the opportunity to really delve into their world and really do the work to try to understand what it's like to be them, and to kind of circumvent those assumptions that we have when we work with anybody, is so important, and something that we could probably talk about for about 3 hours.
Hey guys, thank you for a fantastic presentation. I think people have got loads from that. We've got loads of questions. So the question is, if someone is unsure whether they are autistic or have ADHD, are there any specific resources which we can consider to help through this? I ask because there tends to be a lot of imposter syndrome feelings.
my own personal experience is that the best way to do it is by connecting with neurodivergent community, and luckily we're in the information age, we can do that very easily online. There are like private groups on Twitter that you can access where people just talk about their neurodivergent experiences, and I think it really breaks down a lot of that imposter syndrome that you're describing, which is a really common part, and that's often why people will seek a diagnosis, is to try to kind of combat that imposter syndrome and get that external validation that they are experiencing what they're experiencing. So to my mind, that's the best thing. I also found certain books really useful. As a person who's assigned female at birth, I found Asperger's by, what's her name, Rudy, I can't remember the surname, but that's a fantastic resource that is all accounts of women's experiences of autism, which again I think can help to combat that imposter syndrome. So for me, I think it's more resources around actually accessing community and the voices of people who have that experience of living in the world.
Absolutely, I just echo that. I mean, there are some kind of scales and measures that you can use, but all of them are slightly problematic. So you can kind of delve into some of those. But I think being able to kind of connect with different neurodivergent individuals, share and read their experiences, and then there's kind of various charities like the National Autistic Society, also the ADHD Foundation, the Dyslexic Foundation have a load of good resources as well.
Hi, my question was about alcohol and drug misuse, and I just wondered if you know of any research papers, or if you know yourselves, do you find that people use alcohol and drugs as a way of masking and to be, it's the wrong word, but to feel that they're more acceptable in social situations? Yeah,
I mean, so for sure, there's various different components of this. So using alcohol and drugs as a way of managing emotional and sensory overload. Also using alcohol and drugs in order to navigate social situations, and also for individuals who have an ADHD type profile, sometimes using those kind of stimulates to help regulate what they're experiencing in terms of their kind of physiology and their neurology. So there's various reasons why we definitely see a greater prevalence, and then obviously it becomes tricky, because being able to talk about that and access support is even harder when you're kind of having to navigate differences in terms of your neurodiversity. So it's certainly something that I think it's really important for therapists to be mindful of, and I think there's something about really acknowledging the reality and sometimes the usefulness of that, like and being really honest about that, and then going further and seeing what other avenues there are to help people feel supported and confident and connected.
Yeah, and do you know of any specific research on it? Is there?
There is some research in terms of ADHD and alcohol and substance misuse. There's a little bit in terms of autism and alcohol use. There's not tons, and there's certainly not anything in terms of broader neurodivergent identities. So we're still kind of starting to uncover that at the moment. Mm-hmm.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks.
Hello everybody, thank you for inviting me. Hi, I have a personal experience of someone living with ADHD and autism. My daughter aged and learning disability, so it's pretty complex. She had a meltdown due to restrictions put upon her, particularly around the COVID time, and which resulted in her having a meltdown and a mental health crisis, which could have been avoided had the person caring for and supported her, as you said, not made assumptions and treated her in a way that the way she is, and maybe got some support and advice. But as I said, she ended up having a meltdown and was put on antipsychotic medication, which I'm not a fan of. I'm a therapist myself, and I'm not a fan of chemically medication, although they have their place, but a combination of therapy and medication, fine. So my question was, as I put in the chat room there, how often, I mean, I am asking the psychiatrist for a review because my daughter's no longer hearing voices. That was the reason why she had the meltdown. She said the heightened sensory issues and the environment. So why is she still having them? Because they have a knock-on effect, i.e. side effects. She's now dribbling, she's put weight on. So I want him to have a review. And as you said, she's got the double whammy of being a person of colour and having a diagnosis of ADHD and autism. So I am not going to collude with him and want him to be on there, her on there for any length of time. With that, prior to her having her meltdown, she was absolutely fine. She was functioning. She attended college. She was out in the community doing her thing. And again, the lack of research with women. She's age 41 chronologically and was only recently diagnosed in 2018. And so she kept falling through that net, So, you know, what's your view on psychiatrists willy-nilly prescribing antipsychotic medication for people? Yes, maybe short-term, but long-term. If I didn't ask for that review, I know for a fact that she'd be on there for years and years and years. And you know that people of colour are highly, known to the mental health team and also being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, etc., etc. So I am going to push for a review and to see what his reasons are for wanting her to be on them. I know it has to be a gradual decrease, but yes, and whose needs are being met with her being on them for long term. So I'm not happy. So what's your views on?
First of all, thank you so much for sharing that with us, because it's really important on many, many different levels. And unfortunately, it's something I've seen a fair amount, and I don't even work in a psychiatric medicalized environment. So I'm aware that it's happening an awful lot. And I think one of the reasons why it happens an awful lot is because people interpret the sort of sensory sensitivity, that hypersensitivity, as a hallucinatory psychotic experience, when actually it's just a heightened sensitivity. It's not a psychotic episode. So and often it's easier for them to just treat it in that way. So unfortunately, it's something that happens a lot. It can be really tricky to kind of undo it and to get people to listen to it. And as you say, the double whammy of being a person of colour as well, and probably them being less likely to listen to family for the same reason, that you're more perceived to be taking an aggressive approach rather than an approach that they would listen to, simply because of their prejudices. So that's extra hard. I think, Ruth, you've had experiences of being able to advocate for people in that situation, though, if I'm right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it links back to what Danny was talking about before around the kind of issues around intersectionality and what that means in terms of how individuals are perceived within kind of the medicalized framework. And the need still, there's greater awareness within the psychiatric and mental health teams, but there's a need for much greater awareness, and also the need for specific services. That's a huge area, certainly in the UK, but I know globally, to have specialised services who can support neurodivergent individuals who are going through periods of mental health distress. So, I mean, there's some papers and things that you can point to that are quite useful, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with Danny and I if you'd like, and we can kind of pinpoint you to various things. But thank you for sharing that, because it absolutely highlights an issue that's really important for us to be mindful of.
Thank you.
I just want to take this opportunity to say a massive thank you to Ruth and Danny for an absolutely excellent presentation. You covered a lot of ground there, so you did really well.
You can find various different bits and pieces about Danny and I at the New School website, also the Existential Academy website, and there's you'll be able to kind of pinpoint you to various different bits and pieces that we've done, and more than welcome. That'd be great.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to get in touch with us, please do. You can find our email addresses on the New School website, so that's nspc.org.uk. You can also find details of all of our courses on there if it's something that you want to look at in more detail at a postgraduate level. But yeah, feel free to be in touch. Don't be a stranger. And thank you very, very much for your time and attention.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.